Look around the room you are sitting in right now. I
Yeah.
mean, really look.
Yeah, take a second to just take it all in.
Right, because you probably feel like you are looking directly at a three-dimensional world, don't you? You can see the depth of your desk, the distance to the door, the actual physical volume of a coffee cup sitting next to you.
It feels completely tangible.
It does. But here's the wild part. You are not actually seeing a 3D world at all. Your eyes are only capable of capturing flat, two-dimensional images right on the back of your retinas.
It's completely flat.
Exactly. That rich 3D reality you're experiencing, your brain is secretly running incredibly complex software to build it from scratch every single second of your waking life.
It is a profound illusion that we just, accept as normal.
We really do.
We experience our vision as this direct, transparent window into reality. But functionally, it is much closer to a highly sophisticated video game rendering engine.
A rendering engine, yeah.
We are constantly generating a best guess of the world based on surprisingly limited, entirely flat data.
And that rendering engine is exactly what we are going on a mission to explore in today's deep dive. We are going to figure out how we construct that 3D reality from 2D data.
It's quite the journey.
It really is. We will look at how the primate brain does this naturally and how computer scientists are currently trying to teach artificial intelligence to mimic this exact process to map out diseases.
And of course, what happens when it breaks?
Right, the truly mind-bending things that happen when this cognitive software glitches out. We are covering everything from the heartbreaking visual hallucinations of dementia to the viral internet misconceptions about ADHD.
It is a remarkable intersection to look at, how biology and technology are trying to solve the exact same spatial problems.
So true. And we have an incredible stack of sources for this one. We are pulling from cutting-edge neuroscience papers on something called inverse graphics, deep learning reviews on 3D MRI reconstruction, clinical guides from the Alzheimer's Society of Canada, and a highly relatable Reddit thread from the ADHD community.
A very diverse stack today.
Definitely. So, to understand how our perception of reality can glitch, I feel like we first need to understand how the biological machine works when it is functioning perfectly. How exactly does the brain act like a graphics engine?
Well, to grasp that, we need to look at a concept highlighted in a recent neuroscience news article. They referred to this process as inverse graphics.
Inverse graphics, yeah.
Okay. If you think about how standard computer graphics work, a computer takes a 3D digital model, say a character in an animated movie, and calculates how to flatten it down into a 2D image so it can be displayed on your flat television screen.
So it starts in 3D and compresses down to 2D.
Correct. But the primate brain is doing the complete reverse of that.
Oh, I see.
Researchers have found that a specific part of the temporal lobe, called the inferotemporal cortex, receives those flat 2D inputs from our retinas and mathematically infers a rich 3D mental representation.
It basically works backwards.
Exactly. It works backward from the flat image to deduce the 3D volume. It is inverse graphics.
I really love the analogy of the brain acting like a forensic detective here.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Imagine handing a detective a single, flat Polaroid photograph of a crime scene. Just from looking at how the shadows fall, the angles of the furniture, and, the relative size of the objects in that one flat photo, the detective manages to completely reconstruct the entire 3D room in their mind.
And they do it effortlessly.
Right. Our brains are essentially doing that piece of detective work instantly, constantly, without us ever noticing.
What's fascinating here is why we evolved to do this so seamlessly.
There has to be an evolutionary reason, right?
Absolutely. Researchers actually mapped this process using an artificial neural network called the body inference network. They designed it to closely mirror the specific brain activity in macaque monkeys.
Oh, wow. Monkey brains.
Yeah. And what they found was that this evolutionary adaptation is precisely what allows primates to instantly understand the volume, posture, and spatial orientation of other members of their species.
Which makes total sense when you think about it. Understanding the physical posture and intent of another primate is absolutely vital for social survival.
You need to know what they're doing.
Exactly. You have to know in a split second if someone is leaning in to embrace you or pulling back to lunge at you. And you have to know it even if you are only seeing them out of the corner of your eye from a weird, flat angle.
That spatial awareness is a survival mechanism, hard-coded right into our visual processing stream.
Here is where it gets really interesting, though. Because our brains are so good at running these complex inverse graphics algorithms, computer scientists are now looking at our biology and saying, well, how do we get machines to do that?
Taking inspiration directly from biology.
Right. They are trying to teach AI to see like us, specifically for 3D medical imaging.
This is a massive area of development right now. In traditional medical imaging, like an MRI, doctors are given high-quality 2D slices of the body.
Sort of like looking at individual slices of a loaf of bread.
Right, that is a perfect analogy. But a 2D slice cannot fully capture the complex 3D structural relationships inside a living organ.
Because it's just one flat piece.
Exactly. And this is especially problematic when you are trying to track a neurodegenerative condition like dementia, where the actual volume and shape of the brain tissue are changing over time.
You need the whole picture.
Right. So researchers are using deep learning architectures to feed those 2D MRI stacks into an AI and basically ask it to infer a full 3D model.
I know from the sources that the AI has a few different ways it actually visualizes this 3D space. It is not just, making a digital clay model. It has to rely on specific mathematical frameworks to represent the organ.
It does. There are three primary approaches the AI takes. First, you have point clouds.
Point clouds.
Yeah, this is where the AI generates a sparse constellation of dots floating in a 3D space to map the basic boundaries of the organ.
But dots alone don't give you a solid surface, do they?
No, they don't. And that leads to the second method, which is mesh-based reconstructions. A model called point-to-meshnet is a great example of this.
Point-to-meshnet. Got it.
It takes that sparse constellation of dots and connects them into a continuous surface of polygons, kind of like a wireframe model you would see in a video game.
Oh, that makes sense. And what's the third one?
Finally, you have volumetric grids. These use dense 3D pixel blocks called voxels to represent the actual solid mass and internal density of the organ rather than just its outer shell.
And the practical clinical applications for this are just mind-blowing. One of the articles from Azo Life Sciences details how researchers are using these 3D AI models to physically create 3D bioprinted tissues.
It really is science fiction becoming reality.
It is. They take a patient's own stem cells, and using the AI's 3D rendering as a blueprint, they bioprint a tissue model that mimics the exact microscopic structure of that specific patient's diseased brain.
It's highly personalized.
So personalized, then they can test experimental dementia drugs right on that living 3D tissue. But, okay, let's unpack this. I have a major question about the AI side of things.
Go for it.
If we are training these AI systems on massive data sets of brain scans, most of those scans are going to be from healthy, normal organs, right?
That's generally the case, yeah.
So if you feed that AI a 2D scan of a brain that is severely deformed by disease, doesn't it run the risk of just assuming the brain is healthy? Won't the AI basically autocorrect the disease away because it is biased toward what healthy anatomy is supposed to look like?
That is the absolute biggest hurdle in the field right now. You are touching on a problem developers call overfitting to normal priors.
Overfitting to normal priors?
Yes. To understand why it happens, we have to look at the models researchers are using, like convolutional neural networks or GANs generative adversarial networks.
How do GANs play into this autocorrect problem?
Well, a GAN works by pitting two AI systems against each other. One acts as a generator, trying to build a realistic 3D model, and the other acts as a discriminator, judging if the model looks like a real brain.
So they are kind of fighting each other.
Exactly. It is like a master forger trying to fool an art detective. The problem is, if the art detective AI has only ever been trained on healthy brains, it will reject any deformed, diseased 3D model as unrealistic.
Oh, wow. So it forces the generator to make a healthy brain?
Yes. The system ends up hallucinating healthy tissue to fill in the gaps, completely missing the patient's actual pathology.
Which is incredibly dangerous if a doctor is using that model to diagnose how far a patient's dementia has progressed.
It is a critical flaw.
Yeah.
To solve it, the field is rapidly moving toward hybrid frameworks.
Like combining the different methods.
Exactly. For example, hybrid mesh volumetric models try to balance the learned anatomical rules of a healthy brain with the messy, specific reality of the patient's actual scan.
How do they do that?
They use complex mathematical tools like graph convolutional networks to force the 3D mesh to deform strictly according to the patient's unique contours. It anchors the AI to the raw data, preventing it from snapping back to a healthy average.
It is amazing that we're using all this advanced 3D technology to study dementia, but there is a really dark irony here.
There really is.
The deepest tragedy of dementia is how the disease systematically dismantles the patient's own biological 3D reality rendering software.
The very system we are trying to replicate in AI.
Exactly. So what happens when the hardware running our own inverse graphics engine starts to fail.
Huh.
This brings up a profound clinical phenomenon from the sources called the picture sign.
The picture sign is a type of delusional misidentification syndrome. It happens when a patient with dementia looks at a flat 2D photograph like a framed family portrait sitting on a desk and begins interacting with it as if it is a living, breathing, three-dimensional person in the room with them.
I really want to understand the mechanics of this. How does the brain's rendering engine fail so specifically that it brings a photo to life? The sources mention two main visual pathways in the brain, the ventral stream and the dorsal stream.
Let's break those down. Think of the ventral stream as your brain's what pathway?
What pathway? Okay.
Right. It travels down to the inferotemporal cortex, that exact area we talked about earlier that handles facial recognition and inverse graphics. In many dementia patients, especially in the early to middle stages, this pathway remains somewhat intact.
So they can still recognize things.
Yes, when they look at the photograph, the ventral stream successfully identifies who is in the picture. They know it is their daughter.
But the breakdown happens with the second pathway, the dorsal stream. This is the where-how pathway, right?
Yes. The dorsal stream provides spatial constraint. It tells your brain where an object is located in physical 3D space. And critically, it provides the context that the object is a flat piece of paper inside a frame.
And that gets damaged.
Severely.
Yeah.
In neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia, this dorsal stream is often severely damaged.
So the ventral stream says, hey, that is your daughter. But the dorsal stream fails to chime in and say, and she is just a flat image printed on glossy paper.
Exactly. And to make matters more complicated, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic, reasoning, and reality checking, is also atrophied.
Oh, so the brain loses its brakes, basically.
That's a great way to put it. It loses its ability to hit the brakes. Normally, it would inhibit the brain's natural inverse graphics engine from overreacting. But without those brakes, the brain takes the flat image and simply infers a 3D reality.
It makes me think of a virtual reality headset glitching out.
How so?
Imagine you are wearing a VR headset and a flat 2D pop-up window appears. Suddenly, the software bugs out, the spatial constraints vanish, and that 2D pop-up walks right off the digital screen and sits down on your real-world couch.
That is a very visceral way to visualize the breakdown.
The brain's 3D inference just runs wild because nothing is holding it back.
And it explains a related symptom clinicians call kinematic hallucinations, which is when the patient perceives the static photograph as actually moving or speaking to them.
That is the part that is hard to wrap my head around. How does a static piece of paper appear to move?
Well, it comes down to sensory deprivation and neurochemistry. In a dementia patient, the visual cortex can become hyperexcitable. Often, the brain is suffering from a depletion of a crucial neurotransmitter called acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine.
Right. When the visual centers are starved for clear sensory input from the damaged dorsal stream, they basically start generating their own noise to fill the void. Specific regions of the brain that normally process movement and posture start misfiring.
The sources mention the MT plus V5 area and the extrastriate body area. Just to translate that out of neurojargon, these are functionally your brain's motion detectors and posture trackers going rogue.
Precisely. The brain recognizes the face, builds the unconstrained 3D model, and then those motion processing centers fire spontaneously. To the patient, it genuinely looks like the person in the photo is nodding, smiling, or shifting their posture.
That is wild.
And from a caregiving perspective, understanding this mechanism completely changes how you respond. The Alzheimer's Society of Canada has very specific guidelines on this.
Because you can't just tell them it's not real.
Exactly. They share a case of a patient named Kate who is terrified because she sees large spiders crawling on her walls. The absolute worst thing a caregiver can do is argue with her and say, there's nothing there.
Because to her failing 3D rendering engine, those spiders are absolutely undeniably physically real. Her brain is generating them as a 3D truth.
Yes, you cannot argue someone out of a neurological hallucination. The guidelines suggest you validate the emotional fear first. You say that must be very frightening for you.
And then what?
Then you look for environmental triggers. These misidentifications frequently happen during a period called sundowning, when the sun sets and the light in the room fades, creating long shadows.
Ah, so the brain has even less data to work with.
Right. Improving the lighting can feed more clear sensory data into whatever is left of the dorsal stream, which can sometimes give the brain enough context to break the illusion.
The clinical guide also mentions a patient named Josie who lives in a care home. She constantly believes someone stole her purse, and she usually blames a specific resident.
Another common misidentification.
Yeah. And again, the advice isn't to logic her out of it. You validate her distress, you help her investigate because, occasionally suspicions in care homes are true. And if it turns out to be a recurring delusion, the solution is environmental.
You change the physical space.
Right. You just keep spare replacement purses in a closet. You manage the environment rather than trying to argue with damaged neurological hardware.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is crucial to understand when these kinematic hallucinations and delusions flourish. They almost always happen when the patient is in solitude.
Really? Why does being alone trigger the brain to render these things?
Because when a patient is isolated, the brain lacks bottom-up sensory anchors.
Mm,
If you're in a crowded, noisy room, the sounds of real voices and the physical touch of real people force the brain to stay grounded in a shared physical reality.
they anchor you.
Yes, but in a quiet, lonely room, the brain lacks that anchoring data. Combine that sensory void with the profound loneliness that often accompanies dementia, and the brain will literally generate companionship.
Or-
It uses the photograph on the desk as a seed to create a social interaction, effectively trying to cure its own isolation.
That is just incredibly poignant. The failing brain is using its remaining graphics engine to comfort itself. But there's a flip side to this. What happens when that dementia patient finally turns their head and looks away from the photograph? Often, the person in the picture just vanishes from their mind entirely.
This is a devastating part of the decline. It ties into a concept called retrogenesis. This is the theory that the brain essentially loses cognitive milestones in the reverse order that it gained them during infancy.
Going backward in development.
Yes, and one of the earliest developmental milestones a human infant achieves is object permanence.
Right, the classic developmental psychology concept studied by Jean Piaget. True object permanence is the fundamental understanding that an object continues to exist in the universe even when it is completely hidden from your senses.
A very specific cognitive skill.
So, when a dementia patient undergoes retrogenesis and loses this, turning away from the photo means the visual stimulus is gone, and so the person ceases to exist in their reality entirely.
It's out of sight, out of reality.
Now, wait. Hearing that term object permanence brings us to a massive ongoing internet controversy that I really want to dive into.
I imagine you are referring to the ADHD debate.
I absolutely am. If you spend any time on social media, you have almost certainly seen people claiming that individuals with ADHD also lack object permanence.
It's everywhere online.
We looked at a very relatable thread from the Reddit community Roddish Women, and the users there described their daily lives as feeling a bit like the movie Memento.
That's a powerful comparison.
They talk about creating doom piles of mail on the counter because if they file it away, they forget it exists. They talk about needing to leave all their cabinet doors wide open so they don't forget what groceries they own.
The visual cues are everything.
One user shared a story about discovering an old frying pan in a drawer and feeling like it had literally popped into existence out of thin air. The universal complaint is out of sight, completely out of mind.
It is a remarkably vivid and accurate description of their lived experience, but the friction comes from the terminology. Scientifically and clinically speaking, referring to an ADHD struggle as a lack of object permanence is entirely inaccurate.
The Healthline article we reviewed breaks this down beautifully. What the ADHD community is describing is fundamentally an executive function issue, specifically a severe deficit in working memory and attention regulation.
It is an attention issue, not a reality processing issue.
Right. The ADHD brain doesn't literally believe the car keys vanished from the fabric of reality when they fell behind the couch. What happens is that the object simply loses its priority in the brain's working memory queue.
A helpful way to think about working memory is to compare it to a computer's RAM random access memory. It is the temporary workspace where your brain holds information it is actively using.
The current active files.
Exactly. In an ADHD brain, lower baseline levels of dopamine mean that this RAM buffer is incredibly small.
So it fills up fast.
Yes. If an object isn't currently stimulating the senses, like a frying pan hidden behind a solid cabinet door, it gets immediately overwritten in the RAM by whatever new, shiny stimulus happens to be in front of them.
So what does this all mean? I really want to push back on this on behalf of the internet because in that Reddit thread, users were getting incredibly annoyed by clinicians correcting their terminology.
People feel very protective of the terms they use to describe their struggles.
Exactly. If the lived experience of the person with ADHD feels identical to the item not existing, meaning they completely forget they own a frying pan until they physically see it again months later, why do we care about the terminology? Does the clinical distinction between a working memory deficit and a lack of object permanence actually matter outside of a medical textbook?
This raises an important question about how we view neurodivergence.
Hmm.
And the answer is yes, the distinction matters deeply, specifically for how we manage the condition. Well, if an adult truly lacked Piaget's object permanence, treating them would require fundamental cognitive therapy to teach them the basic laws of physics. You would have to convince them that matter continues to exist when they close their eyes.
Which would be impossible.
But we know that is not the problem. The adult with ADHD knows, conceptually, that the frying pan exists. The bottleneck is entirely in the brain's memory retrieval and attention allocation.
So diagnosing the exact mechanism completely changes the treatment plan.
Entirely. You do not treat ADHD by teaching the person that objects are real. You treat it by hacking their environment to bypass that tiny working memory buffer.
Changing the physical space again.
Exactly. You take the cabinet doors completely off their hinges so the visual cues never stop. You use clear plastic storage bins instead of opaque cardboard boxes.
So everything stays in the visual field.
You employ techniques like body doubling, where simply having another person sitting in the room helps anchor your attention to a mundane task.
Yeah.
You accommodate the retrieval bottleneck because you know their fundamental grasp of physical reality is perfectly intact.
That makes total sense. You are hacking the physical environment rather than trying to fix a reality processing error that doesn't actually exist. It is a completely different approach to care.
It is all about working with the brain's hardware rather than fighting it.
Well, we have covered some truly profound ground today. We started by looking at the inverse graphics engine inside a healthy primate brain, decoding how we instantly reconstruct 3D scenes from the flat 2D images hitting our retinas.
A fascinating process.
We saw how computer scientists are using deep learning AI and battling the auto-correcting bias of GANs to replicate that exact biological process to map out diseases like dementia in 3D.
Biology inspiring technology.
We explored the tragic breakdown of that 3D reality software in dementia patients, unpacking the mechanics behind the picture sign and kinematic hallucinations. And finally, we cleared up the clinical reality versus the internet myth of object permanence, looking at the working memory struggles of ADHD.
It is a sweeping journey through how our minds perceive the world. And I want to leave you with one final concept to mull over.
Let's hear it.
If our entire perception of a three-dimensional world is just an ongoing active inference, a mathematical best guess constructed from flat data on the back of our eyes, then reality itself isn't something you passively observe. It is something your brain actively generates every single second of your life.
Actively rendering reality.
Yes. So it makes you wonder, what else is your brain rendering right now that you completely take for granted as objective truth?
That is a thought that will definitely stick with you the next time you look around the room. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you look at a photograph on a desk, just remember the incredibly complex, exhausting software your brain is running just to keep it flat on the wall. Catch you next time.